the Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with KTOO, present the 2019 World Affairs Forum, Modern Journalism, the Role of News Media in a Changing World. In her talk, Trolls, Sock Puppets, and Bots, Oh My, How Political Campaigns Have Dealt with Fake News and Propaganda Efforts, Dr. Jessica Baldwin-Philippi of Fordham University looks back beyond the 2016 election to discuss the longer histories of malicious campaign practices in campaign communication and internet culture.
I research political campaigns and kind of how they've dealt with new technologies in a kind of post-Obama time frame. And so that involves kind of how they develop strategies, but also how they respond to problems like, say, fake news, which, although not particularly new, I'm going to walk us through some of the recent histories of that. So despite the large image of bots here, I want to talk to you about more than bots. I got into this particular project, so going into the 2016 election, in like 2015, I was like, you know what, I'm going to be done with political campaigns. I wrote a book about them. I've researched a lot about them. I want to move into like municipal governance, kind of doing the work on the ground. And I was sucked back in, not least of all because of what happened in the 2016 election. I actually wanted to avoid having to attend to that academically. But I got into it because I became frustrated with a lot of what I heard about kind of the debriefing in journalism about what had happened in the election. And this isn't going to be a like the journalism is bad, but I think there's a lot of interesting kind of overlap going on there. So one of the things I'm not going to talk about today, but I do want to, this is about kind of modern journalism as well, so I'm going to make a small pitch for it. One of the things that I found deserving of more research attention was kind of the discussion of Cambridge Analytica and big data and how it persuades us and kind of these assumptions or these claims that like it was this massively powerful and like kind of almost infallible system. And interestingly, like we actually don't have a lot of good data that all that kind of extra big data is what changes our political beliefs. So like there was some fascinating kind of filling in of the gaps, both on the journalistic side and from the campaigns themselves. So like it serves their own interest to say like this is the most powerful, right? Then like later on in the next year, people will buy their products that they have asserted are so powerful. So there's like a strategic reason for that. So that's one thing that I found kind of frustrating. But then another one was the kind of the way that bots especially were being discussed, right? So in the aftermath and even leading up to the 2016 election, what we get is kind of news coverage that sounds a lot like this, right? Bots help fuel feuds. They change politics. They're hijacking the conversation, right? This emphasis on bots in particular, right? We have the fake news conversation, but actually, right, that as a term of art even emerges after the Trump administration is an administration, right? Because it's this moment when Kellyanne Conway kind of starts talking about it too. And so we have like some of this that happens, like we get this later, but right following and even leading up to the election, there's this kind of massive concern about bots, which of course, these headlines don't say it in particularly, but is tied to this kind of the claim that this is all about Russian interference also, right? Which totally important and truthful to say also, but right, like that's where the concern is lying. And so thinking kind of like, what are we missing when we only talk about bots and when we only talk about Russia was kind of a thing that I became interested in. And I became interested in the question of what do we miss when we talk just about bots, because from my prior research, in campaigns in 2010, 2012, 2014, I had seen a lot of other what I would have called lineages of bots or kind of precursors to bots and kind of this kind of counting as fake news type of stuff that I thought was falling away when we started to talk about bots. And so I want to go through a couple of those types of disinformation to draw this kind of recent history in the hopes that then we can talk about what is different about bots and why, and kind of how do we approach contemporary problems by seeing them as more than just bots, and kind of what are we missing if we only focus on that part. And so the first kind of, sorry, these are a little bit off kilter, I guess, and they'll get lost in translation. But the first kind of thing that jumped out to me as like being a very obvious corollary to bots was this idea of sock puppeting, which the kind of term or the definition here is going to be that running a profile of a fake person, right, to voice support or concern for a candidate or a policy. And so what our historian yesterday tells us about the Hamilton writing the newspaper in a bunch of fake names, right, to do this work. So I'm going to tell you the recent digital past, but just the idea that that lineage, that would count as a sock puppet also. And so when I was doing my ethnographic research in one campaign in particular, but then doing interviews with other campaigns in 2010, this was kind of one of the big stories of 2010. I know there's a lot of text here, but I want to show this whole thing. This is what was then called a blog, would probably now be called a vertical of a newspaper, but who is writing about tech and politics in Illinois. This is from Eric Zorn of the Chicago Tribune. And he was kind of covering and bringing together a variety of these different stories that had been about different campaigns engaging in sock puppetry. And so we have the second story here is of the profiles that their IP address gets traced back directly to campaign headquarters, right? And so this then becomes a news item of, oh, the campaign is getting into the comment section and building profiles to support their candidate. Kind of fascinatingly, with this stuff. This happens repeatedly in 2010. I kind of, at that moment, hadn't heard of it a ton, and went back and this was happening in 2008. New York Times had written stories about it in 2008, kind of as a new digital tactic too. So this has a longer history too. But interestingly, so we think, okay, this is bad when campaign staff do it, right? They're lying about who they are. But also it overlaps significantly with some instructions, some strategies that campaigns were actually engaging with what they often called their virtual volunteers at this point in time. But they were telling their supporters to go comment on things, right? They were not telling them to make fake profiles to do so, to be clear. But they weren't telling them to use their obvious name, and this was a moment in time where comment sections didn't tend to be connected to your name either, right? So now the New York Times asks for your actual name, right, as a kind of bulwark against this stuff. But at that moment in time, they weren't, right? So campaigns are telling their virtual volunteers, go forth, go enter into the comments, and this was seen as totally okay, right? And the ethics of campaigning, people didn't have a problem with that. They did once campaign staffers start pretending to be other folks, right? There was one kind of interesting case in this mix of somebody being well, I'm a Republican, but I like this Democrat, right? And lo and behold, they're actually a Democrat, right? And so, right, but so proving that you're the outsider in this case. But so, right, the kind of difference between staff and volunteers doing this prevents the ethical problem or the kind of actual problem there. But then fascinatingly, recent studies have shown that especially kind of outside of the local context, in the national news context, that even people are contracted kind of at scale, and especially contracted from developing nations to do this work. So there was recently a very interesting study from, let me get this right. Actually, this has not been published yet, but some work coming out of some faculty at Leeds in the UK who've done some studies of Filipino workers in particular who are being hired to build out these profiles, right? It's low-wage work, and thinking about the kind of the global economy as both allowing and almost encouraging kind of this because of global kind of economic inequity. And so that this work is being contracted out, not for ideological reasons, right? The folks who are doing the labor to create these profiles are not doing it because they care at all about how the election turns out, but because it earns $2, right, to make and continue to labor toward a profile. And so we see kind of perhaps different, we might say, oh yes, this is bad, but kind of similar things are happening kind of across a variety of, with a variety of goals in mind, right, whether they be economic or ideological. And so that presents a problem or a quandary for how we begin to tamp down on this, right? If they have very different origin points for why this thing is happening, if somebody is just doing it out of the their desire for a certain type of politics, that is a very different kind of reason and probably dedication than the economic form. And so thinking about the tactics behind this stuff, right? People build personas. It takes a long time. The longer you do it, the more credible the thing is. People steal photos and kind of change them slightly, maybe, if they don't want them to, if they're worried that it will show up on a reverse Google image type thing. They spoof IPs over time, right? Because the 2010 campaign gets in trouble for seeing that it's your IP. So, okay, you learn how to spoof the IP. So in some ways, it's like this escalating arms race. If we teach media literacy type things that are like, look to the profile and reverse Google image it. Well, they Photoshop it a little bit, right? So it doesn't totally come up, right? But this arms race of beating out the media literacy kind of tactics is going on. And so interestingly, the good story here is that this gets found by journalists. Right? Like the way we hear about these things, and I will say, like, by and large, we do hear about a lot of them, that is journalists doing this work. I will note that it is also often the opposition of campaigns who are doing this work and feeding it to journalists. Like that's an important kind of attention to who's doing that work and why. But journalists are publishing on it, right? So it's not like this kind of dour, like this is just happening and nobody's paying attention to it. People are, in fact, paying attention to it and trying to let the public know about it. But so then I want to talk about astroturfing, a very similar kind of process. But this idea that organizing that is meant to seem like grassroots efforts, in fact, is supported by big money, right? Often we talk about this as kind of corporate efforts, but there have also been non-corporate supporters of this as well. And so, right, the idea here is that this content is meant to appear as like everyday actors, right, rather than substantive PR efforts, even if substantive PR efforts exist all the way and we like totally know they do and we're relatively okay with that, right? The attempt to hide that. And so this is like well known in the kind of environmental advocacy field. This is just one example of a kind of well-known AstroTurf agency, but called the Energy and Policy Institute, right? Often given names that are kind of like purely informational, not necessarily taking a side, right? But this is a group that like doesn't have nonprofit status, isn't registered to do any like particular lobbying, right? So like the traditional ways you would find out about them, right? Like they're not hitting that mark, and they then are able to and often do create these like kind of elaborate Facebook pages where, importantly, real people come together. So we'll kind of get to that. Just to highlight another example. This is of an actual Facebook page, and it was like Facebook first rather than like really big organization first. This is the Citizens for Tax Freedom. This is a slightly old page. You can see all the trappings of like Tea Party aesthetics, right? Fascinatingly, this is in Michigan, and this was marketed as marketed is another word, but publicized as an organization of conservative folks. And it just so happened that they had this like one policy position, and it just happened to be a more democratic policy position, right? So they're using the trappings to try and get the conservative folks into the page, and then saying, despite our conservatism, we are advocating for this other thing. They're doing the same kind of shadowy practices about who is paying for their stuff in both of these cases, right? And so, right, we know that PR happens, but here there's this kind of lack of knowledge or lack of information about who is doing the production. And I want to highlight the fact that this happens in political campaigns, my bread and butter also. And it's often called the dark arts of campaigning. So in 2008, right, we have the Hillary Clinton ad, the like original grassroots, somebody took the 1984 ad and like makes it into Hillary Clinton's face. And like lo and behold, it was actually an Obama staffer who said, and I think presumably, right, he did it on his own time, right? But of course, this also makes you like that you are hiding your attention, your connection to the Obama campaign. He got fired, right? But that stuff like this is rampant in the political campaigns world as well, right? And the kind of the combination here, right, is that this involves real citizens, right? And especially if we think about the advocacy examples. These organizations pull people who are interested, right? They're not full of bots. We'll talk about bots in a second. But their goal is not to just get the message into the world, but the message is actually to get people organizing, having meetings, right? Even the environmental cases, there's a lot of kind of this type of grassroots, or this type of AstroTurf advocacy around pipeline stuff. And they actually like get people to come together in meetings. The actual humans who come are then doing the advocacy too, right? It's the kind of apparatus around it that is being made unclear, right? And so what this is, it's about like hiding the people who are financing it or the organizations who are financing it, right? And I will say that it's important that this is happening despite regulations about disclosure, right? So all of these things abide by the law, right? They are paying attention to our regulations. They are in fact saying like the paid for language for whatever organization, some shell LLC usually, that are in fact paying for it, right? And what our paid for language requires is like that kind of disclosure, right? And they are actually doing it, but that's still even abiding by the regulations here allows for the hiding of kind of the reality of who is financing something, which will become important. And so again, we have this like pretty good news story of this often being publicized, found out by journalists, right? And so like this isn't all bad news. There are often news stories written about like, okay, we don't understand who is publishing this stuff. The LLC of Citizens Tax Freedom doesn't seem to be connected to any identifiable thing. We think they are connected to this, right? There's like journalistic investigative work that goes on around this stuff. They found out that the Obama staffer did this, right? We are finding out about this stuff, but it's taking kind of that investigative journalism to do so. And now we get to bots, right? So again, using kind of the same stuff, and I'll actually show a picture from the group that Eric talked about, right? But basically talking about computational propaganda that uses things like Sockpuppets, right? Those fake profiles, and then uses algorithmic attention, right? To game kind of the attention apparatus to get to those fake profiles and to use those fake profiles to get attention to news stories. Importantly, and this is why I wanted to talk about the grass tops or the AstroTurf stuff, is that bot networks can be entirely sock puppets, or they can be used to support real actors, right? I could go buy a bot network and have it support my very important research that I want everybody to see, right? It doesn't, like not everything there is entirely a false kind of, it's not always necessarily in service of a false story or a not real kind of actor either. So these are two diagrams of bot networks. The one on the left is the kind of liberal or Democrat and Hillary Clinton connected bot network. The one on the right is the Trump conservative right bot network. As you can see, they look kind of different. They look kind of similar, but right, similar in their structure, but different in important ways. The one on the right is much more, this is also from the Oxford Internet Institute, the same study that Eric mentioned. The one on the right is much more condensed, meaning that they recirculate each other's content more. The one on the left, you see those hubs, but not that much cross-pollination, right? Meaning that they recirculate content of one person, and then kind of a bot will retweet that, but there's not the kind of cross-pollination going at all the same time, right? And so what this kind of means is that the right was doing it better, or doing it so that the message gets out more and more kind of seems to have more support for each message too, right? But that this is happening at both levels, right? Or at both spaces. The one on the apparatus on the right is certainly better built out. And so we think like, okay, we can think of what these look like. Sorry, it's a little small for everybody. But here's like one of the more conservative memes, right? They don't have to be about electoral politics, right? Importantly, they're about kind of these political wedge issues. So this one's about attention and kind of respect for veterans. The ones on the right tended to be about Black Lives, or the ones on the left tended to be about Black Lives Matter, right? And kind of making kind of extraordinary claims about I can't think of one example in particular, but right, but kind of making like, oh yeah, there shouldn't ever be white people allowed in public, like some absurd kind of claim that would never be the statement of an actual Black Lives Matter kind of organization, attributing it to them, right? But so they don't have to be about political issues. They're about wedge issues. They're about gun rights, right? They're about abortion. And then we do see ones that are connected to politics explicitly too, right? The Clinton campaign and the Sanders campaign, right? Trying to kind of contribute to the wedge between these two parties on the left even too, right? So this is happening in kind of a variety of things, not just political campaigns and not just issue advocacy either, right? And so there is something new and important here. I'm not giving this whole talk to say like bots aren't important, right? The scale is new, right? The scale at which these messages kind of circulate, the fact that even on the left, like the not as productive bot network, right? Still highly productive, still getting a message retweeted by kind of, if you're any of those nodes, you can see kind of the starburst that comes off of it, right? That you're going to get that much more attention. And in fact, it exploits the kind of the algorithmic underbelly of social media as we know it, right? Importantly though, it relies on the structure of platforms, right? So like bots are nothing without the structure of network and without the actual existence of the material kind of platforms like Facebook and like Twitter and even like Instagram, right? That's an Instagram post, interestingly. But that they rely on the structure of platforms in order to work. Like, so part of my kind of way in here was that we have all this discussion about bots, and we don't have as much discussion of the platforms that they are reliant on. And so I also want to highlight that how to detect all of this is a moving target, like just like, so we have one media literacy piece that is often kind of touted. If someone's account has all these numbers in their name, that's because it was algorithmically created, because it's easy to write a script that will create a name with a number combination, because it's unlikely to already be used. That's why they attach all those numbers on the end. So we have that as like a heuristic for media literacy. But then, of course, the creators of these bots figured that out. They know that we are looking for that, and they're like, we will change our ways, right? So like, it's an arms race going on here too. And interestingly, the ways to detect what or who is a bot, right, is best done at scale. Excuse me. It's best done at the network level. And so it is, by default, through no fault of our own, much easier for somebody who sees the network, who gets all of the data and does this type of analysis to see who is a bot, right? And so it requires, or it doesn't require, but it is made a whole hell of a lot easier by having kind of access to not only these skills, but these data sets. And so this isn't, I would argue, a project for individual kind of media literacy, but at this platform level. And so this kind of question of like, where does the problem lie and who gets blamed for it is pretty central in my view. And so when we look at who actually gets blamed for all of these things, we do see some parties that I would argue are incorrect. The first one is journalists, right? Time and time again, I've shown that like journalists are the ones doing the work to highlight this stuff. And they're doing a pretty good job. Sometimes they need help of campaigns, and sometimes they need help of advocates in opposition parties, right? But they're doing a pretty good job. And the kind of claim that the news that journalists are unwilling or unable because of the current media environment and they're not getting enough clicks and attention, right? That doesn't seem to bear out. Like there are stories about this stuff, right? The second group that gets blamed is us, right? That we just need to be more media literate, we need to learn all these things, and that like yes, we are motivated reasoners, yes, we do have all these kind of psychological things working against our ability to tell, or our willingness to tell real from fake, right? But interestingly, when you start to pay people, if you are like, okay, if you get all these questions right, you get $10. We get the questions right, right? So like this kind of interesting mediating variable of like what makes us more literate. Like, what are our motivators at that moment in time, right? When we're just scrolling through something and like, okay, maybe we see kind of all the examples of it, partisan to nonpartisan things we might be interested in. And like, yeah, we're willing to kind of look at that until we're given a direct incentive too. That might be like reason to think about incentivizing how our eyeballs are kind of measured and how we enter into economic exchange by giving our data and what we get out of that. Like, that might provide some kind of a way into kind of thinking about how to make us be better by like, right, the idea that we are actually paid to get better is kind of fascinating there. But also just this idea, I think it's important to say that like, the answer is not at this level to me. Just even if we get the best media literacy trainings, these things crop up because people find new ways and new tactics to get around our most recent trainings, right? So sure, being smart and critical and kind of bringing all of your important toolkits are great to reading news, but that I don't think the answer will be found at that level. Right, and then, so I think looking toward platforms is the beginning of the right answer. But the other way that this is framed for like who gets blamed is that this is a technological problem. And so if we have Facebook and there's a problem with fake news there, this was one potential that Facebook actually piloted for how to stop the spread of fake news. So they would actually, this has the little disputed by third party thing, and if you went to recirculate it or even click on it, this would pop up that says disputed by third parties. So they piloted this. As you will note, we don't have this, right? People got really, people publicly got really mad, I will say that, right? There was a significant backlash from especially conservatives who said that they felt that their type of news was either being or likely to be more going to pop up here, right? So there was an inherent or immediate claim about like the assumption that Facebook was going to be partisan in doing this even before they saw what news stories were subject to this. But so, like, I think that this would have been great and helpful, but it also treats it as a purely technological problem. And if it's a technological problem of recognizing fake news, then there's a technological solution, right? Like, if just finding the best pop-up could be it, then we don't have a problem with Facebook. And I would argue that like solving technical problems is great, but thinking of platform problems as a whole, of like, why is Facebook the way it is? And what are its goals? And how might its goals, even if they come up with some technical solutions, not suffice, is kind of what I want us to think about, right? And so I would say we need to think about how this is a problem at the level of social media platform, which involves the economic underpinnings. How do things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram make their money, right? Which when you begin to think about, I'll get to this in a slide later, but when you begin to think about what are the actual purposes, not what do I want to use them for, but how do they make money, right? We begin to see a bit of a disjunct there. And so thinking not as just one algorithmic fix that could be made, but how does the fact of the algorithm, the necessary kind of the inherent of the algorithm for social media sites present us with a problem if we want them to be, or if we think they are, important kind of news vehicles. And so I will pause here to say, it's a platform problem, so like regulate the platform becomes the kind of immediate, kind of an easy kind of next step. But I want to highlight some ways that regulating is not just difficult in the making a policy, but difficult in the why culturally for these platforms that poses a particular threat. And to do that, we have to talk a lot about digital cultures and kind of internet culture as a whole. And so if you kind of know the vast history of the internet, we can think, okay, there's this kind of a Department of Defense history and all of this stuff. But another history of the internet is its history that is rooted in counterculture. So Fred Turner has written a great book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture that talks about these roots. And so pre World Wide Web internet, but talking about kind of the importance of countercultural movements to the internet, which was, the important thing here is that these movements saw themselves as like independent of society, outside, different, right? And like radically free and like little d democratic, right? And importantly, during the actual counterculture movement, like those little d democracies like reproduced all of the inequities that we see in regular society too, right? They were like deeply sexist, right? They were deeply racist. And so Fred Turner's argument is that this like idea of freedom and like leveling the playing field that was baked into these platforms like never worked out in the first place either, right? And that this idea that you could do that is reproduced in these places too. The second kind of history that I want to say is important is that of hacking or trolling. Trolling and hacking as it's connected to that has this like really long history in playfulness, in like mockery, right? This is the logo of the Cult of the Dead Cow, which has newly gotten attention because Beto was a member. But so this idea that like they'd put a Volkswagen on the roof of an MIT building, right? Like it's pranksterism, right? And this is connected to counterculture too, right? But so this idea of like a joking playfulness, pretending to be someone else, right, is totally built up into the values of the internet, and I would argue the values of social media too. And so this doesn't mean that these things don't turn political, right? So even if we have anonymous as like a more modern version of the Cult of the Dead Cow, we then have like anonymous doing explicitly political things that we might support, right? Anonymous has taken on kind of an anti-Nazi, anti-white supremacy movement, right? This is one of their Good Night White Pride, one of their kind of many more political acts that Anonymous has taken on. They've given information to a variety of protesters during kind of what was called the Arab Spring, right? Giving them kind of lessons in how to avoid surveillance, kind of doing work that people might agree with, but kind of showing this move from hacking into a more political advocacy type of avenue, right? But so what also is important here about both the kind of history of hacking and the history of counterculture that are important to the internet is that even within those, we have these kind of conflicting values of total absolute freedom, like radical democracy, that technology will level the playing field. And then also this constant reference to a need for and like the way that the internet will always be transparent. And so like if you look at all of these early internet manifestos, like the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, we hear a lot of these values both being touted kind of at the same time, and there might be very obvious ways, right, if we're talking about hacking, that they might disagree with one another. And yet we have them kind of as kind of fully throated of the internet values. And then I want to talk a little bit about the kind of the culture of the ad-supported internet as the internet that we know it, right? This choice is made at the dawn of the World Wide Web to make all of this content free because information and transparency is great. But of course, how will we get it all? The answer is advertisements, right? Some have called this the original sin of the internet. But the idea that if we are to get content, we need to pay for it somehow, and we will pay for it with our eyeballs. Right? And finally, this kind of other value that is there in early internet culture, that voice, that like political voice, the ability to speak, and information, the internet as a vehicle for informing the masses, for getting any information you want, are conflated a lot of the time. And so this idea, though, that like, sure, the internet is a tool to get lots of information, but really at its core, the internet is a tool for anybody to provide their information as well, right? And both of those things are true, but the fact of voice, the fact of like a platform for anybody to publish things, certainly has ramifications for what we might think of as a contemporary fake news kind of era, right? So I give you this history to return to the point of the previous slide, which is that the problems of the platforms are like integral to the platforms, right? So it might be easy enough to say, where I was on the previous slide, that like there are these huge problems with our social media platforms, and we should work against them. But in many ways, like they're baked in with the values that we want of the internet too, or at least that historically we have wanted and maybe not thought about second-order consequences. And so the question of like how do we begin to approach this becomes both important and difficult, there might be some ways forward though. So I think one way forward is that platforms and the technology firms that they are owned by, right, are in fact news organizations. They have not been treated as news organizations by the law. Section 230, as it is known, is the law of the mid to late 90s that says that in fact platforms cannot be held accountable for the bad or fake or whatever things that people say on them. This law was kind of built around a message board where somebody was saying something. I actually forget the exact problem with what the person was saying. Maybe it was libelous or something like that. But basically, the idea that the courts upheld, or that the courts didn't exactly uphold it, a law was passed that then said that platforms could not be held accountable for the content within their spaces, right? Because they are not active news providers. They are not creating news. They are just empty vessels for other people's information here. But if you think about how we use the internet, how we use social media, if you look at Pew data, tons and tons and tons, even now a majority of people get news online, a plurality on social media, right? So if you think about how we actually use these tools, they in fact are news providers, right? In fact, a lot of them have had places, or like had parts of them dedicated to things like the news feed, right? So Facebook actually used to, I use the past tense, in the upper corner, like the trending kind of news piece, right? And thinking about how, now that Facebook has gotten rid of that, how actually that like could be a political kind of saying, oh no, we're not a news provider if we delete like our actual news feed there, right? But thinking about how those things are very common and in fact built into the tools. Twitter trending ideas, right? Like they make sure to not say trending news, right? But just says trending. But right, the idea is that in fact it is news there, and there are arguments being made about the importance of those things there as news items. The other thing that I think is a good way out here is that we need to treat transparency as more than just authorship. Like I started with those kind of the Astroturf campaigns. They're following the rules, right? They are saying the funding organization, but time and time again, especially in a digital place, it has been found that like those kind of shell companies, it's not enough to disclose that, right? Basically, this idea that transparency will save us is kind of in many ways premised on the expense that it would often take to get into places like radio, especially TV, right? So the idea that if you had the money to do that, you must be like a semi-legit operation, right? That now with the flattening of how much advertising costs in a digital place, the kind of accounting for shell actors is actually kind of a semi-new problem, if not entirely new. But also that when we talk about what transparency should look like, it needs to be more than just like a byline or just that name, that actually there need to be databases that are searchable, that we can go back and look for who those companies are, make the connections across them, that data actually needs to be like available. And so when we talk about like how TV is regulated, for instance, like how buying political ads on TV, it's not just that you have to do the paid for language, which you have to have in digital places, even social media too. It's not just that you have to do the paid for kind of language. The fact is that that TV companies have to keep a record of who bought those ads. So right, that idea of the record of the database that somebody, a journalist or a citizen, could go to and look at is super important here. And I think we also should think about, like I think those are good kind of approaches, but I think we should also think about global economic inequity, right? How things like outsourcing to developing nations, outsourcing our production of news profiles or of fake profiles, right, might might have like this clear kind of grounding in global economic inequity, and how we haven't thought through that part of how that will influence our own politics is super important. And finally, that I think we need to talk about kind of the actual content of these pieces of the fake news part, right? The content of that, right? The fact that it's about gun rights or abortion or Black Lives Matter, right? The fact that it's about issues of race and gender and all these things are the problems that we have, not like the bot technology, and that we should kind of reflect on the importance of those in our own society if we want to kind of figure this stuff out. So, thank you.
Are there any actual humans in the room as opposed to bots?
So would like to ask questions, please. Bots have a much faster reaction time.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, could you comment on the use of state on the state actors such as Russia and other nations coming in to basically cause chaos or create a specific effect without supporting any particular program or candidate?
Yeah, I actually think, to me, the most threatening part of that is not which country is doing that. Like, not that that doesn't matter. We have a long history, though, of like figuring out how to engage in kind of the information warfare. But so it's not that like, oh, this is a Russian effort or an Iranian effort or a whoever effort, right? So much as it actually highlights like the very obvious problems of racism that exist in the country, right? And I actually, like, my concern is that we see bot and we get freaked out about the technological, and that it's not like, this is obviously because we have deep problems of racism and sexism and whatever else like in this country, right? And so I fear that a technological fear, or even an international politics kind of fear, overshadows the like very real and obvious problems that we would have without the kind of the existence of those actors too. Like, I think they're important, but I'm concerned about the way that it elides other conversations too.
Right.
Yeah, you talked about platforms becoming news organizations, and therefore, am I understanding correctly that they would then be responsible for the content?
So they are not. I think that is a claim that ought to go through the courts, and I think there is a lot of weight behind that at this particular moment. It's a relatively new or a relatively newly popular attempt kind of legislatively. But so at this point they are not, and I think that's a big problem.
And I have heard that Facebook is mightily resisting that.
Yes.
But my question is, how do we hold news organizations responsible? Isn't Breitbart a news organization? And don't they publish things that are erroneous?
I mean, we don't have any laws in this country about the fake problem of it, right? So the thing that the regulation gets you is about the ad buys in particular too, and so that they then have to make the ad buys public. If that's the case. So it doesn't solve the problem for sure. But it does make the advertising piece. And interestingly, in social media, we have like a variety of kind of different genres of advertising, right? You have like the obvious ads that appear on the right-hand side that if you have an ad blocker, you don't have to see as much, or our eyeballs have trained us not to look at, but they are still there and we still kind of look. But then you also have like the sponsored posts within the feed, right? And so those are both paid. The more, I don't want to say just nefarious, but the more strategic and like fully built out like fake news operations will boost a post, right? So there is still some money there. So then we have, like, we no longer just have this category of just like ad or post. We have a regular post that is made but then boosted, right? And so the kind of, if it were treated the exact same way as a news provider, they are paying for something. The idea would be, sure, it might not look exactly like the old model of ads, but if they're paying for something, it counts as an ad, and that should then be recorded and paid attention to, right? And so we'd have at least some inroads there, even if we wouldn't be able to legislate the taking down the false claims.
Don't make noises. Everything is fine. They're well built, so am I.
I think you need to improve your act to include handstands. But my question is, we hear a lot about bots and other means of disinformation. Do you have anything on how much money is rolling around here? Because yes, this occurs, but what comes up in your talk is, hey, well, we're getting a lot of mileage out of money that can't be traced. Mm-hmm. So if you have anything that you can give us a hint on how much is moving around there, particularly for political misinformation or propaganda, as opposed to what takes place in traceable spots, which would be TV ads or something like that.
So I don't know an answer to that. That's a fascinating question that you might have a better answer. Geisha might have a better answer for you. The interesting thing about what happens on social media in particular is how cheap it is to do, though, compared to the TV effort, right? So you don't need the scale of cash. I would still guess there's a significant amount of cash going around doing this, but you don't need the Swift boat amount of money, right, to get on TV and run that ad to do some of this work. There was even, so after the Roy Moore, the campaign, right, there was this, a Democratic-leaning group that was we're running a bunch of ads that are trying to be divisive in this place to see how it works, right? And that was done at less than $100,000, right? Not a lot of money in this particular arena, and I would actually guess it was significantly less than $100,000. That was the thing of the whole, how much it cost. So I guess the ads themselves cost significantly less. You don't need a ton of money to begin doing this work, but I also wouldn't. I don't know I don't know if there are people who try to count that stuff even though it's dark money, but I would guess also it is probably still a significant amount of money even if one actor doesn't need a ton.
Well, just follow up, because the resistance of the social media companies would be proportionate to how much money they're making off this.
Yeah, and I mean, so they've built out these tools, so I actually wanted to, I made some notes and then didn't say them because you don't say what you don't practice. But right, thinking about even when Eric was talking about some of this stuff, right, the native ad things, right? Native ads used to be, and in traditional newspapers are pretty big like that, right? But in Facebook, right, the move from just having the ads over here to putting them in the newsfeed to then having sponsored posts, which not only say sponsored, but also have who your friend liked them, right? So that it tells you that it's credible in this way, that actually much data has shown that that's super productive, or not for the world, but for Facebook's money, right? So that Facebook is actually motivated, and Twitter and Google, right? This is not just about social media, it's about Google too, are motivated to actually build tools that are worse for the world and better at getting our attention and our kind of belief in that too.
I'm so sorry. You're so funny. I just wanted to, of course there are deep issues in our society that are divisive, that have always been divisive. I think that still we should not underestimate the technology challenge, because it is about foreign actors or false actors actually having the same level of influence in a political debate that is very much about real people in a real place. So I think that's the challenge with bots, is the fact that you can put a bot network to work to amplify something that is not as popular as it appears in the political discourse, which then unevenly affects our debate, right? And that is exploiting our freedom of expression. And I personally don't think that a bot should have the same freedoms as a real person, right? So when we think about that's the technology challenge, I think. The second, every time that platforms say that they are not news organizations or news providers, I always go back to the editorial piece, because they actually do curate the kind of content that we see. We know through algorithms, we know what goes at the top of the news feed. And so I think the editorial piece is the piece we need to keep pushing. As long as you don't let the content as it's coming out just roll through your news feed or your page, you continue to be a news organization. And so I think, and legally, we have not gotten there yet. I think this is how they just like shift some of the blame. And you're right on that. And then third, on the advertising and the promotion of posts, it's really cheap. Yeah. So in the Mueller report, when in the indictment on the Internet Research Agency, the St. Petersburg troll farm, we found that ads would run between $15 all the way to thousands. But a $15 ad of Bernie Sanders wearing an LGBT superhero outfit, saying that he was going to rescue the entire community, would get traction because real people would believe in it and then amplify it, right? So it's just about promoting. And there's also the data question of you can target specific groups that would believe this. And so you can spend $5 promoting it to the 18 to 22-year-olds in Florida and have that go organically through. So lots, thank you so much. This is actually really great because you laid out so many of the different tools, and it's true. There's the real people that hold real beliefs, and then there are the people that do it for other incentives. So thank you so much, Jessica.
Yeah. But yeah, just that idea of the algorithm as editor, right? It's not new in academic circles, but it's relatively new kind of popularly. The obviousness that an algorithm is humanly made is created by people, right? Is like relatively newly publicly okay, right? Like 2 years ago, academics were saying this and people were like, what, it's math, right? And like still a significant portion of like human-computer interaction, computer scientists kind of disciplines will be like, it's math. And like to be like, let us think through the humans that create the math, right? Yes, it's so obviously like they are not called editors, but they are doing the work of doing that. Like, and only recently have we begun to like really attend to that.
Can I go? EU has recently voted in new rules about hosting copyrighted material on Facebook and other locations. Like, they're going to have to come up with some really advanced filtering technology to accomplish those new requirements. Can you envision that being co-opted in some fashion to apply here?
I mean, the idea that we have the regulatory, like we need the regulatory apparatuses here, or the kind of the political environment, just like we have not followed suit on so many good things that the EU has done. So like from kind of data ownership, the understanding of a person has ownership over their own data, right, is like a radically different perspective than we have here. So I guess I'm not optimistic that we will take that, but that proves that these companies, these tech firms can do it, right? Like, so the idea, like for a lot of the claim making on the part of the technology firms is that like we can't do that. Either it's like against our ethos, right? And they take a very US-centered focus or definition of what freedom of speech is, right? It's radical freedom of speech, right? Not like the EU case where like you can't have hate speech. But they also just say like technologically that would be too hard. And like now this stuff proves that technologically they will be able to do it. Just like Twitter kicks all the Nazis off in EU countries, right? Because like they can't have hate speech, right? So like the fact that these platforms look different in other countries proves that they can do it, and I would say should be like a way for us to organize around it. But to date, like it's not a particularly optimistic comparison because we haven't adopted those data standards, right, that have now existed for quite a while there. I would hope that, but I don't know that I'm as hopeful.
A comment and a question. When you had the who is to blame, and it was the consumers or the people, it just reminded me of blaming the victim.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're the victims of what you're talking about.
And I mean, like the structural, I mean, and so we've been talking about environmental news too, right? Like it's great if we recycle and we don't like throw junk down the drain, right? Like there are many good things we can continue to do. But like the idea that that will save us is kind of ridiculous and puts the onus like on us in this way that is like both not gonna solve the problem and blames us for these kind of structural conditions, right, that we live in too, yeah?
Exactly. My question is, I know Geisha talked about the St. Petersburg, the Internet Research Agency.
Yeah.
Do we have those here in the United States?
We don't have as organized groups. I don't think that's to say they wouldn't happen, at least that we know of too, right? This is like, okay, what's that?
U.S. Cyber Command?
Yeah, are you right? We have a long history of international information warfare, right? But if I was thinking in the U.S. context, are there kind of people trying to work our partisan stuff? I mean, we have. There are certainly smaller operations on both parties, and not from the party apparatus, but from consulting groups, right? Consultants buy bots all the time, like super common. And so so another kind of part of this is there isn't like a code of ethics among political practitioners. Actually, interestingly, myself and 3 other colleagues, Adam Scheingate from Johns Hopkins, Daniel Kreis from UNC, and Letitia Bodie from George Washington are in the very beginning stages of kind of inviting practitioners to talk openly about ethics in hopes of kind of making sense of this, and if not like having standards, then kind of at least publicizing, I don't know, we think standards will be hard to get to, but publicizing kind of things that people seem to agree on, at least, like as relatively cohesive units of things that, not just like what academics should think should be the best, but that practitioners are like willing to also kind of have some buy-in to. So we're in the very beginning stages of doing that because like it's a relatively new idea.
And that's our time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Dr. Jessica Baldwin-Phillippe's talk, Trolls, Sock Puppets, and Bots, Oh My! How Political Campaigns Have Dealt with Fake News and Propaganda Efforts, recorded on March 30th, 2019 at UAS in Juneau, as part of the 2019 Juneau World Affairs Forum. Modern Journalism, the Role of News Media in a Changing World, produced by KTOO and the Juneau World Affairs Council in partnership with the University of Alaska Southeast. With support from AEL&P, Coeur Alaska Kensington Mine, DreamHost.com, Haight & Associates, Sea Alaska, and Wastman & Associates.